before continuing, write where you are from or what time it is. The white cotton of William's dress shirt felt like ice against my skin as I pulled it from the gym bag. It was Tuesday, 9:17 a.m., a time that should have been mundane, filled with the hum of the washing machine and the quiet of an empty house. My twins were at school and Emma was at her piano lesson. I was just Jennifer, the dedicated wife, the woman who kept the gears of our perfect life turning. Then I saw it. A smear of blood-red lipstick on the collar, bold and unapologetic. It wasn't a medical stain. No surgeon wore that shade of crimson into an operating room. My heart performed a slow, sickening roll in my chest. For 15 years, I had built my identity around being the anchor for Dr. William Carter, the brilliant cardiac surgeon. I had deferred my own teaching career, managed our colonial home in Oak Ridge Heights, and raised our 3 children while he climbed the hospital hierarchy. We were the perfect Carters, the envy of the hospital fundraisers. But as I stood in our walk-in closet, the shirt dangling from my trembling fingers, the illusion shattered. The silence of the house became deafening. I didn't scream. I didn't throw things. I just stood there, staring at that small, waxy mark that represented a total betrayal of everything we had built. I tucked the shirt back into the bag, my mind racing. William had been working late for months, claiming the hospital was understaffed. Weekend golf trips had become his new obsession. Our conversations had dwindled to scheduling and household logistics. I had blamed the pressure of his new promotion to chief of cardiac surgery. I had even bought new lingerie and planned date nights, trying to follow every piece of advice from those glossy magazines on how to keep the spark alive. He had participated half-heartedly, his eyes always glued to his phone. "Just tired, Jen," he would say. "The Jenkins case is complicated. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I believed in trust. I believed that Jennifer Carter was too smart, too secure to be the paranoid wife checking phone logs. But the shirt changed everything. It was a physical artifact of a lie I could no longer ignore. I felt a sudden violent urge to purge. I made it to the bathroom just in time, vomiting until there was nothing left but the bitter taste of bile and the realization that my life was a movie set with no foundation. That evening, I waited until the children were fast asleep before I went to our bedroom. William was already there, methodically removing his expensive watch and placing it on the nightstand. He looked so calm, so centered. It made the fire in my gut burn hotter. "Are you sleeping with Rebecca Harrington?" I asked. My voice didn't shake. It was steady, cold, and unfamiliar even to me. William didn't flinch. He didn't offer a frantic denial or a clumsy excuse. He simply looked at me with eyes that had turned into chips of blue glass. "Yes," he said. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. The coldness in his tone was like a physical blow. "How long?" I whispered. He sighed, as if my questions were an inconvenience. "Does it matter? I want a divorce, Jennifer." The words were an execution. He wasn't asking. He was informing me of a business decision. He told me he had outgrown this life, outgrown us. He looked around our bedroom as if it were a prison cell he was finally escaping. 15 years of marriage, 3 children, and a lifetime of shared dreams were dismissed in a single breath. I stood my ground, even as the world tilted. "We built this life together, William," I reminded him. "Everything you are is because I stayed behind, so you could move forward." He actually laughed. It was a bitter, jagged sound. "I save lives daily, Jennifer. What do you do? Bake cookies for fundraisers? Organize my sock drawer? I built this life despite the anchor of domesticity." His words were designed to shred my self-worth. He saw my years of sacrifice as a burden, a weight he was finally cutting loose. He told me I would be taken care of financially, as if money could patch the hole where my heart used to be. He left for the guest room, leaving me alone in the room where we had conceived our children and mourned our losses. I lay awake, the silence of the room pressing down on me. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a stranger with a surgeon's precision for cruelty. I realized then that the lipstick stain was just the beginning. The next morning, William was gone before dawn, leaving a lawyer's business card on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker. It was a declaration of war. I didn't call his lawyer. Instead, I made an appointment with Patricia Winters, a woman known in Oak Ridge Heights as the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state. I walked into her office 2 hours later, my eyes dry and my mind sharp. "Document everything," she told me, "especially the finances." That night, after the kids were in bed, I opened our home safe. I expected to find tax returns and property deeds. What I found were dark threads in the fabric of our wealth. Monthly withdrawals of $5,000, $7,500, and sometimes $10,000 were moving from our joint savings into an entity called Riverside Holdings. There was no explanation. Over 2 years, nearly $250,000 had vanished. I stared at the numbers, the ink blurring as I realized William hadn't just been planning an exit. He had been looting our future. I called the bank the following morning. The account manager was hesitant until I reminded him my name was on the account too. Riverside Holdings was an LLC registered solely to William. The trail ended there. When I showed the statements to Patricia, her expression shifted from professional to predatory. "This is calculated," she said. "He's been preparing for this for a long time." Then she dropped a name that made my skin crawl. Dr. Nathan Brooks. He was a former colleague of William's who had vanished from the medical community 3 years ago under mysterious circumstances. William had always dismissed my questions about him, calling it professional differences. Patricia suggested he might have a different story. I tracked him down to a small clinic 40 miles outside the city. When I called, his receptionist tried to block me until I said my name. "Mrs. Carter," Brooks said, his voice heavy, "I've been expecting your call for years. We met at a nondescript coffee shop, halfway between our worlds." Nathan Brooks looked like a man who had seen too much. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told me about the fertility clinic at Ashford Medical Center, where William had worked. He talked about failed IVF procedures and lab reports that didn't match the results. My hands gripped my cup so hard, my knuckles turned white. We had gone through 3 rounds of IVF for the twins and 2 for Emma. Every failure had been a mourning period, every success a miracle. Brooks told me the clinic director was falsifying results to maintain funding and success rates. "And William?" I asked, my voice a whisper. "William was more than aware," Brooks said. "He was complicit." He slid a thumb drive across the table. It contained hospital records, lab reports, and William's signature authorizing procedural modifications. My breath hitched as Brooks continued. He told me William had a hereditary heart condition, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It was mild in William, but there was a 50% chance of passing it to his children. A man with William's ambition couldn't risk having children who might reflect poorly on his professional image or his perfect genetic legacy. The implication hit me like a tidal wave, knocking the air from my lungs. "You mean he didn't want his own children?" I asked. Brooks nodded slowly. "During your treatments, he ensured his own samples were never used. The clinic used anonymous donors while telling you it was his. William knew exactly what he was doing. He had manufactured a family that looked like him, but carried none of his perceived flaws." I left the shop with the thumb drive, burning a hole in my bag. I wasn't just a discarded wife anymore. I was a woman who had been robbed of the biological truth of her own children by the man who swore to protect them. The drive home was a blur of gray highway and white-knuckled grip. I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching a stranger steer a car toward a house that was no longer a home. My mind kept looping back to the twins' birthdays, to Emma's first steps, to every moment I had looked at them and searched for a glimpse of William in their smiles. It was all a lie. A clinical, calculated deception performed by a man who treated his own family like a lab experiment. I pulled into the driveway of our colonial home, the white picket fence looking like the bars of a cage. I had to keep it together. I had to be the mom they needed while I planned the destruction of the man they called father. That night, I became a thief in my own house. I waited for the rhythmic breathing of my children to signal they were deep in sleep. I moved through the hallways like a ghost, collecting DNA. I took hair from the twins' brushes and saliva from Emma's toothbrush. I even went into the master bath and found an old comb William had left behind. The 2-week wait for the private lab results was a slow-motion torture. William had moved into a sleek downtown apartment and accelerated the divorce proceedings. His lawyer sent a series of intimidating letters, questioning my emotional stability and suggesting I was an unfit mother. They offered a settlement that was insulting, a fraction of what I knew we had. It was a move to starve me into submission. William even had the audacity to show up at Emma's piano recital with Rebecca. She stood there in a designer coat, looking at my daughter with a proprietary smile that made me want to scream. I didn't. I nodded politely. I played the part of the wounded, fading wife. I let them think they were winning. Behind the scenes, I was working with Patricia and Agent Dawson, a man from a healthcare fraud task force I'd contacted through Dr. Brooks's leads. Dawson was intense, a man who lived in the details of spreadsheets and legal precedents. He told me they had been watching Ashford Medical for 18 months, but couldn't get past the wall of silence. My evidence, the thumb drive from Brooks and the financial records I'd pulled from the safe, was the crowbar they needed. But we need more, Jennifer, he told me. We need a confession or a direct link to the current operations. I realized then that I couldn't just wait for the law. I had to be the one to bait the trap. I started reaching out to other families from the clinic. Most were too afraid or too happy with their children to listen, but 5 families agreed to meet. The stories were all the same. Miraculous conceptions after multiple failures, always under the personal care of Dr. Mercer and William. Sarah Wilson, a woman whose twins looked nothing like her or her husband, cried as she realized her gratitude had been built on a fraud. I met Diane Fletcher, a former nurse from the clinic, in a cramped apartment filled with filing cabinets. She was the one who had seen it all. She had kept a secret journal for 12 years, documenting every specimen substitution and every falsified consent form. "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. She showed me a bitter smile. "I tried," she said. "The hospital board, the ethics committee, the police. Every time, the investigation just vanished. Your husband has powerful friends, Mrs. Carter." She handed me a business card for a specialized medical ethics unit. "Ask for Agent Dawson," she said. I realized then that Dawson hadn't just found me. The trail of breadcrumbs had been laid by women like Diane for years. I photographed every page of her journal, my phone clicking away as I captured William's signature on instructions to replace specimens due to quality concerns. My own name was there, a cold entry in a ledger of betrayal. The lab results finally arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee in front of me. The email notification popped up, and my finger hovered over the mouse. When I finally clicked, the words were like stones. The alleged father is excluded as the biological father. Probability of paternity, 0%. I printed 3 copies, one for the safe, one for Patricia, and one for a cream-colored envelope. I didn't feel the surge of grief I expected. Instead, I felt a hard, cold clarity. William had stolen 15 years of my life, but he wouldn't steal the next 15. I had the power to dismantle his career, his reputation, and his freedom. I just needed the right stage. I began to record our phone calls and our brief meetings during custody handoffs. I learned to steer the conversation toward the children's health. "Do you think the twins inherited your heart condition?" I asked him during one tense exchange in his new lobby. William looked annoyed, his eyes darting to his watch. "There's nothing to worry about," he snapped. "I had them tested years ago. They're fine." I pushed a little harder. "How could you test them without my permission?" "I'm their father and a doctor," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. I made a medical decision. The recorder in my pocket caught every word. He had just admitted to knowing about the condition and performing unauthorized tests, all while maintaining the fiction that they were his biological children. It was the final piece Agent Dawson needed to prove William's state of mind. The opportunity for the final blow presented itself in the form of an invitation. The annual Ashford Medical Center Gala was the event of the year. This year, William was being honored as Physician of the Year for his groundbreaking work in cardiac surgery. He texted me, saying he would be taking Rebecca, but I was welcome to attend if it wouldn't be too awkward. I replied with a message that sounded like a woman finally accepting her defeat. "I wouldn't miss seeing you receive the recognition you deserve," I wrote. What he didn't know was that I had already met with the hospital board chairman. I had shared just enough evidence to trigger an emergency executive session 30 minutes before the gala was set to begin. I spent the afternoon before the gala getting ready. I chose a sleek black dress, something Rebecca had once mocked in a text I'd found on William's phone. I wanted to look like a widow at a funeral, because that's exactly what I was attending. The funeral of William Carter's career. As I zipped up the dress, I looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't see the perfect wife anymore. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and come out with eyes like flint. I checked the cream envelope in my clutch. It contained the DNA results and a letter from the district attorney's office. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. All I had to do was walk into the room and let the truth do its work. The hotel ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and expensive tuxedos. The air smelled of lilies and high-end perfume, but to me, it felt heavy with the scent of an impending storm. I walked in alone, my head held high, ignoring the hushed whispers that followed me. I saw them across the room, near the stage. William looked every bit the Physician of the Year, his chest puffed out, a glass of champagne in one hand, and Rebecca on his arm. She was wearing crimson, the same shade as the lipstick stain that had started it all. It was a deliberate choice, a trophy of her victory. I mingled with the wives of other surgeons, women who had looked down on me for years. Margaret Reynolds, the wife of the chief of surgery, caught my arm. "So brave of you to show up, Jennifer," she whispered, her eyes brimming with fake sympathy. I smiled, a sharp, cold thing. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Margaret." The board meeting had ended just moments before I arrived. I had sat in a small side room, watching through a cracked door as Agent Dawson laid out the financial fraud and the fertility clinic records. I had watched the faces of the board members turn from disbelief to cold, calculating anger. They weren't just angry about the ethics. They were terrified of the lawsuits. The hospital's legal counsel had already alerted the police. As I moved through the ballroom, I saw the plainclothes officers positioned near the exits. William was oblivious, basking in the light of his own ego. He thought he was the master of his universe, unaware that the stars were about to fall. When it was time for the awards, the room fell silent. Dr. Helena Winters, the board chair, took the stage. She didn't look like a woman about to give an award. She looked like an inquisitor. William ascended the stairs to thunderous applause, his smile practiced and humble. He took the crystal trophy and turned to the microphone. "Medicine is a sacred trust," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ethics must guide every decision." I watched him from the back of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Beside him, Rebecca beamed, her eyes fixed on his face. I wondered if she knew the truth about the heart condition, or if she was just another piece of equipment in his life. Our eyes met for a split second, and I saw a flash of something in her gaze. Not triumph, but a strange, haunted recognition. After the speeches, the crowd began to migrate toward the after parties. I knew William and Rebecca were heading to Vincenzo's, our favorite restaurant, the place where he had proposed 15 years ago. It was a cruel, poetic choice for their celebration. I followed them 20 minutes later. When I walked into the restaurant, the maitre d' recognized me immediately. "Mrs. Carter, your husband said you might join them," he said, leading me toward the back. William was either so confident in his victory that he didn't care, or he wanted me there to witness his final triumph. They were seated at our table, a bottle of 1982 Bordeaux between them. It was a vintage that cost more than my monthly mortgage. William looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from surprise to a smug, patronizing mask. "Jennifer, this is unexpected," he said. I stood at the edge of the table, feeling the weight of the envelope in my hand. Rebecca shifted in her seat, looking uncomfortable. "Perhaps I should go," she murmured. "Stay," I said, my voice cutting through the soft opera music playing in the background. "You've earned your place at this table, Rebecca. Or should I call you Rebecca Harrington?" The color drained from her face so fast, it was like a curtain dropping. William's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. I looked at Rebecca, whose eyes were suddenly wide with terror. "She knows, William. She's the daughter of Madeline Harrington, the patient whose death you covered up 5 years ago." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. William turned to Rebecca, his face contorting. "Is this true?" She didn't answer, her silence a screaming confirmation. I didn't stop. I placed the cream-colored envelope on the table. "Congratulations on your freedom, William. I think you'll find this more interesting than your trophy." He opened it with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the DNA results. "This is impossible," he whispered, the words barely audible. "No," I said, leaning in. "It's science. You ensured your sperm was never used because you were too afraid of your own flawed genetics. You lied to me for 15 years. You stole the biological truth of my children." William's face twisted into a mask of rage. "You're fabricating stories because you can't handle the divorce," he hissed, his voice rising. But I wasn't alone. I gestured toward the entrance of the restaurant, where Dr. Winters, Agent Dawson, and 2 uniformed officers were walking toward us. The restaurant went dead silent. The patrons at the surrounding tables stared. Agent Dawson reached the table and placed a hand on William's shoulder. "Dr. William Carter, you are under arrest for medical fraud, financial crimes, and violations of the Medical Practice Act." The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. As they led him away, William turned back to me, his eyes filled with a pure, concentrated venom. "You've been planning this for months," he spat. "All that time playing the agreeable wife?" I looked him dead in the eyes. 15 years, William. You had 15 years of living a lie. I only needed 3 months to expose it. Rebecca was left sitting at the table, staring at her wine. I didn't know about the children, she said quietly. I looked at her, seeing the wreckage of her own revenge. I believe you, I said. Your mother deserved justice too. But the truth belongs to me now. I walked out of the restaurant and into the cool night air, the first breath of my new life feeling like a victory. The aftermath was a whirlwind of headlines and legal proceedings. The story of the surgeon of secrets dominated the local news for weeks. William was held on a massive bond, his hidden accounts at Riverside Holdings frozen by the district attorney's office. The fertility clinic at Ashford was shuttered, and a full-scale investigation into every procedure performed over the last decade was launched. I spent my days in Patricia's office or in meetings with Agent Dawson, untangling the web of lies William had woven. The forensic accountants found that the $250,000 he had siphoned wasn't just for his mistress. It was a getaway fund he'd been building since before he even met Rebecca. He had never intended to stay. He had just been waiting for the right moment to discard us like old surgical scrubs. The hardest part wasn't the legal battle, it was the children. How do you tell a 12-year-old and 10-year-old twins that the man they called Dad had effectively erased their biological history? I sat them down in our living room, the space where we had spent every Christmas and birthday. I chose my words carefully, focusing on the truth of our love rather than the mechanics of William's betrayal. I told them that their father had made some very bad choices at the hospital and that he wouldn't be coming home. I told them that they were miracles, no matter how they came to be. Emma cried, her small shoulders shaking, while the twins sat in a stunned, protective silence. It broke my heart all over again, but I knew that a life built on a lie was a life with a rotten foundation. We would build something real, even if it was hard. As the weeks turned into months, my unlikely alliance with Rebecca Harrington began to take shape. She reached out to me through her own lawyer, offering evidence of William's malpractice in her mother's case. We met in a quiet park, far from the prying eyes of the press. She looked different without the designer clothes and the red lipstick. She looked like a woman who had been consumed by a ghost. I didn't do it for the money, Jennifer, she said. I did it because he killed her and walked away with a promotion. I realized then that William was a predator who used everyone in his orbit. He had used me for stability and a perfect image, and he had used Rebecca to satisfy his ego and escape the guilt of his own mistakes. We were both victims of his arrogance, just in different ways. The trial was a grueling affair. I sat in the front row every day, watching William in his orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller, the aura of the brilliant surgeon stripped away to reveal a desperate, hollow man. Dr. Brooks testified, his voice steady as he detailed the tampering at the clinic. Diane Fletcher presented her journals, the physical evidence of hundreds of betrayals. But the moment that truly ended him was when the DNA results were read into the record. The court went silent as the expert explained that William had no biological connection to his children and had knowingly falsified the records to hide his own genetic condition. The jury's collective gasp was a verdict in itself. William didn't look at me once. He stared at the table, his hands shackled, a man who had finally run out of secrets. When the final verdict came down, it was a clean sweep. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 20 years, citing the unprecedented level of clinical and personal cruelty involved in his crimes. As they led him out of the courtroom for the last time, I stood up. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't feel like an accessory. I didn't feel like the woman who made his life possible. I felt like Jennifer, just Jennifer. I walked out of the courthouse and was swarmed by reporters, their cameras flashing like lightning. I had prepared a statement, but I realized I didn't need it. The truth had already spoken for me. I returned to our colonial home that evening. The white picket fence didn't look like a cage anymore. It was just a fence. I had secured the house and the children's future using the funds recovered from Riverside Holdings. The court had ruled that the money belonged to the victims of his fraud, and I was the primary claimant. I sat on the porch, watching the sunset over Oak Ridge Heights. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Dr. Brooks. The hospital had finally agreed to set up a memorial fund in Madeline Harrington's name and was reopening the fertility clinic under a new independent ethics board. He wanted me to be part of it, a consultant for patient rights. I looked at the message and smiled. My teaching degree was still valid, and I had already been offered a position at the local high school for the fall. I had a career, a home, and children who knew the truth of their own lives. The path ahead was messy and complicated, and there were still days when the weight of the betrayal felt like it would pull me under. But I wasn't an anchor anymore. I was the captain. I went inside and started dinner, the sound of the twins arguing over a video game and Emma practicing her piano filling the house. It wasn't a movie set. It was a life. The first year after the trial was about reclamation. I didn't just go back to teaching. I became an advocate. I spent my weekends traveling to conferences, speaking about medical ethics and the rights of IVF patients. I used the Perfect Carter's story as a cautionary tale of how easily prestige can mask a predator. Every time I spoke, I felt a little more of the old Jennifer coming back, the one who loved history and believed in the power of truth. I wasn't just the woman who dropped the DNA test. I was the woman who rebuilt a community from the rubble of a scandal. My children watched me, and I saw a new kind of respect in their eyes. They weren't just the children of a disgraced surgeon. They were the children of a fighter. In the summer of 2026, I decided it was time to move. The colonial house held too many echoes of William's voice and the quiet horror of my discovery in the closet. I sold it for a price that allowed us to buy a bright, modern house closer to the city and the university where I had started a part-time master's program. On our last night in the old house, I walked through the empty rooms. I stood in the walk-in closet where I had found the shirt. It was just a small, square room now. No polished Oxford shoes, no gym bags tucked in corners. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't expected. I had walked into this house as a woman who believed her value was tied to a man's success. I was leaving it as a woman who knew her value was inherent. I met Rebecca one last time before we moved. She was moving too, heading back to Chicago to be closer to her father's remaining family. We sat at a small cafe, two women bound by a history we never wanted. "Do you hate him?" she asked. I thought about it for a long time. "I don't have enough room in my life for hate anymore," I said. "Hate requires focus, and I'd rather focus on my kids." She nodded, her eyes clearing for the first time since I'd met her. "I think my mother would have liked you, Jennifer." We didn't hug, but there was a shared understanding as we walked away in opposite directions. We were both moving forward, the shadows of William Carter finally fading in the rearview mirror. The children adjusted to the new house with surprising ease. Emma's piano was in a sun-drenched room overlooking a small garden, and the twins had a basement that was perpetually filled with their friends. We made new traditions: Friday night movies, Sunday hikes, and a rule that we always talked about the hard things, no matter how much they hurt. I watched them grow, seeing their individual strengths emerge. They were kind, resilient, and brilliant in their own ways. William had been so afraid of their flawed genetics that he missed the fact that they were perfect exactly as they were. His loss was my greatest gain. One afternoon, I was sorting through some old boxes when I found the cream-colored envelope. I had kept it as a reminder of the day I took my life back. I looked at the DNA results, the zero staring back at me. I realized then that the biological connection didn't matter. It never had. Being a parent isn't about DNA. It's about being there for the 9:17 a.m. discoveries, the piano lessons, the scraped knees, and the hard truths. I had been their mother every second of their lives, and William had never been their father, not because of the clinic, but because he didn't know how to love anything more than his own image. I walked out to the garden where the kids were trying to plant a vegetable patch. The sun was warm on my back, and the air was filled with the sound of their laughter. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had trembled as they held a stained shirt a year ago. They were steady now. I was 46 years old, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. I wasn't the surgeon's wife. I wasn't a victim. I was the author of my own story, and the best chapters were still waiting to be written. I picked up a shovel and joined my children in the dirt, building something real, one seed at a time. As the sun began to set, I thought about the gala and the restaurant and the look on William's face as the handcuffs clicked. That was the end of one life, but it wasn't the end of me. I looked at Emma, who was carefully labeling the rows of seeds. "Mom, do you think these will grow?" she asked, her face smudged with soil. I pulled her close, smelling the scent of grass and sunshine on her hair. "I know they will, Emma. We've got the best foundation in the world." I looked toward the house, the lights glowing warmly in the twilight. We were home, and this time there were no secrets behind the door. The next morning, I received a phone call from Agent Dawson. He told me that William's final appeal had been denied. He would be staying exactly where he was for the foreseeable future. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a final heavy door click shut in my mind. I didn't need to check the news or follow the updates anymore. William was part of my history, not my present. I grabbed my bag and headed out the door to school, the hallway filled with the energy of a family that was no longer waiting for someone else to tell them they were enough. I stepped out into the world, ready for whatever came next, knowing that no matter what happened, I would always choose the truth, even if it started with a blood-red stain on a white cotton shirt. The new house in the city felt like a fresh lung, breathing life into a woman who had spent 15 years suffocating in a colonial museum. I stood in my new kitchen, the sleek marble counters cold under my palms, and checked my watch. 3:14 p.m. In 6 minutes, the twins would be home from their new middle school, and Emma would be trailing behind them after her robotics club. My life was now measured in these quiet, predictable increments of peace. But the peace was fragile. A thick manila envelope sat on the table, its return address chilling the air. State Correctional Facility. William had sent a letter. My first instinct was to burn it, to let the lies turn to ash in the sink. Instead, I forced myself to sit. I opened it with a kitchen knife, my hand steady, a far cry from the trembling fingers that had once held a lipstick-stained shirt in a walk-in closet. The handwriting was still arrogant, sharp angles and decisive loops. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was demanding an audience. He claimed he had vital information regarding Riverside Holdings and a second set of accounts that the forensic team had missed. Accounts he promised could double the children's trust if I visited him. It was a classic William move, a lure disguised as a gift. He was still trying to be the provider, the brilliant architect of our reality. I felt a flicker of the old anger, a heat in my chest that tasted like copper. I didn't need his blood money. But Agent Dawson's voice echoed in my head. If there's more money, Jennifer, we find it. For the families. The social ladder of my life had moved from private grief to public advocacy, and I couldn't ignore a lead that might help the 27 families William had defrauded at the clinic. I didn't tell the kids. I watched them eat their snacks, listened to the twins argue over a coding project, and felt the weight of the secret like a stone in my pocket. The next morning, I drove the 2 hours to the facility. The air inside the visiting room was thick with the smell of floor wax and old coffee. When William was let in, the orange jumpsuit looked like a costume he was wearing for a play he hated. He sat down, the plexiglass between us a mercy. "You look tired, Jennifer," he said, his voice still carrying that patronizing tilt. I didn't smile. "I'm busy living a life that isn't a lie, William. Talk about the accounts." He leaned in, his eyes darting to the guard. He didn't talk about money. He talked about Dr. Mercer. He claimed Mercer wasn't just falsifying records. He was selling the biological data of the patients to a private research firm. The room felt suddenly thin. This wasn't just fertility fraud. It was a harvest. William offered me a name, Cytocor Systems. He told me the Riverside Holdings withdrawals were actually payments to cover his tracks when he realized Mercer was going too far. He was trying to frame himself as a whistleblower who got caught in the crossfire. "I was protecting you, Jen. I was protecting the children from the fallout," he whispered, his hands pressing against the glass. I looked at the man who had ensured my children weren't his, who had lied for 15 years, and who was now asking me to believe he was a hero. I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. "You weren't protecting us. You were protecting your career," I said. As I walked away, he yelled a final string of numbers, a routing code that would change everything. The numbers William screamed followed me all the way back to the city. I didn't go home. I went straight to Agent Dawson's office. We spent the night in a room filled with monitors and half-empty pizza boxes. When the routing code finally cleared, it didn't lead to a bank. It led to a secure server in a data haven overseas. Dawson whistled, a low, sharp sound. He wasn't lying about the data, Jennifer, but he was lying about his role. The server contained the quality concern logs Diane Fletcher had mentioned, but with a terrifying addition. The genetic profiles of every child born from the Ashford Clinic were being tracked and updated. William hadn't been protecting us. He had been the one selling the updates. He was treating my children like proprietary software. The revelation hit me with a sensory jolt that made the room spin. I felt the urge to go home and lock every door, to wrap my children in blankets and never let them see the sun. But the perfect wife I used to be was dead, and the woman who replaced her knew that safety wasn't found in hiding. It was found in exposure. We spent the next 3 days building a digital net. I reached out to Dr. Nathan Brooks, who helped us translate the medical jargon into a language the public could understand. We weren't just looking at a divorce anymore. We were looking at a landmark case of genetic privacy. The stakes had climbed from my private bank account to a public battle for the future of every IVF child in the country. The pressure began to mount. Cytocor Systems sent a cease and desist order to my house, delivered by a man in a suit who stood too close to my front door. My phone started ringing at all hours. Blocked numbers, heavy breathing, or silent hang-ups. One afternoon, I found a red lipstick mark on my windshield, a direct echo of the shirt that started it all. It was a warning. Someone was trying to scare the suburban mom back into her lane. I took a photo of the mark and sent it to Dawson. "They're getting desperate," he texted back. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. For 15 years, I had been the anchor. Now, I was the storm. I decided to go public. Not through a lawyer, but through a televised interview that would reach every home in Oak Ridge Heights and beyond. I sat in a studio under hot lights, the makeup artist trying to cover the dark circles under my eyes. When the camera turned on, I didn't talk about the cheating. I didn't talk about the divorce. I talked about the children. I showed the logs. I showed the signatures. I told the world that my husband, the physician of the year, had treated his family and his patients as commodities. The interview went viral within minutes. By the time I walked out of the studio, Cytocor's stock was in a free fall, and the FBI was raiding their headquarters. I got into my car and sat in the dark for a moment, my heart a steady drum. I had just traded my privacy for justice, and for the first time, the trade felt fair. The fallout from the interview was a tidal wave. The Ashford Medical Center board was dissolved, and Dr. Mercer was arrested at a private airfield trying to board a plane to Switzerland. But the victory was bittersweet. The twins came home from school one day with bruised knuckles and silent faces. Someone had called them the lab kids. I sat them down, the air in the living room heavy with the cost of our truth. The truth is a heavy thing to carry, I told them, but it's lighter than a lie. Emma sat between them, her small hand gripping her brother's arm. We were no longer the perfect Carters, and the neighborhood of Oak Ridge Heights had turned its back on us, but we had something they didn't, an authentic life. William sent one final message through his lawyer. He was offering to testify against Mercer and Cytocor in exchange for a moved sentence to a minimum security facility. He wanted me to sign a statement saying he had acted under duress. I met his lawyer in a sterile conference room. The man pushed the paper across the mahogany table, the same way William used to push the kids' school forms. It would secure the remaining funds for the children immediately. The lawyer said it was the final power flip. William was trying to use the children's financial future as a bribe for his own comfort. I picked up the pen. The lawyer smiled. A small, smug victory. I didn't sign. I wrote, "See you at the hearing" across the signature line and walked out. The final hearing was a public reckoning. The courtroom was packed with the families from the clinic, Sarah Wilson and the Millers sitting in the front row, their eyes fixed on the man who had stolen their peace. When I was called to the stand, I didn't look at William. I looked at the families. I detailed the Riverside Holdings trail, the genetic tracking, and the 15 years of calculated silence. I told the judge that justice wasn't a business transaction, and it couldn't be bought with hidden accounts. William's face transformed from a mask of arrogance to one of pure, unadulterated fear. He realized then that I wasn't the woman who would make it all possible for him anymore. I was the woman making it impossible for him to ever hurt anyone again. The judge's gavel sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. William's request for a moved sentence was denied. In fact, based on the new evidence of the data sales, 10 years were added to his term. As the guards led him out, he stopped in front of me. His voice was a low hiss, a final attempt to wound. "You've destroyed their father, Jennifer. They'll never forgive you for this." I looked at him, seeing nothing but a hollow shell of the man I once thought I loved. "I didn't destroy their father, William. I just stopped pretending he existed." I turned my back on him and walked toward the families waiting in the hallway, the sound of my own footsteps, the only rhythm I needed. 6 months later, the city house was finally a home. The garden I had started with the children was blooming, rows of vibrant green pushing through the soil. I stood on the porch, a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the twins race their bikes down the sidewalk. Emma was at the outdoor table, her sketchbook open, capturing the way the light hit the oak trees. We were $250,000 poorer after the legal fees, but we were 1,000,000 times richer in spirit. The Physician of the Year trophy, sat in a box in the garage, a relic of a life that felt like a movie I had seen a long time ago. My teaching job at the high school was steady, and the students didn't care about my past. They cared about the history I taught them every day. The Ashford Families Support Group met in our living room once a month. We weren't a group of victims. We were a community. We shared resources on genetic privacy, navigated the medical questions together, and celebrated the birthdays of children who were miracles, not because of a clinic, but because of the love that raised them. Dr. Nathan Brooks often joined us, his gray hair a bit lighter now that his conscience was clear. He and I were co-chairing the new ethics review committee, making sure that no doctor would ever be able to treat a family like a laboratory again. It was a slow, difficult work, but it was the most important thing I had ever done. I still saw Rebecca Harrington occasionally. She had stayed in the city, working as a patient advocate herself. We were an unlikely duo, the mistress and the wife. But the fire William had started had forged us into something unbreakable. We didn't talk about him anymore. We talked about the future. We talked about the way our mothers would have been proud of the way we stood our ground. The red lipstick that had once signaled the end of my marriage was now just a color I occasionally wore when I felt like a fighter. It was no longer a mark of discovery. It was a mark of ownership. That night, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, I tucked the children into bed. Emma looked up at me, her eyes clear and bright. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" she asked. I kissed her forehead, the scent of lavender and home filling my senses. "We aren't just going to be okay, Emma. We're going to be real." I walked downstairs and out onto the porch, looking at the house I had built from the wreckage of a lie. The foundation wasn't made of polished Oxford shoes or hospital fundraisers. It was made of truth, resilience, and a love that didn't need a genetic match to be absolute. I thought about the woman I was on that Tuesday at 9:17 a.m., the one who stood frozen in a walk-in closet with a trembling heart. I wished I could tell her that the scream she was holding back would eventually become a voice that would change the world. I wished I could tell her that the bang she was waiting for would be the sound of her own strength. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air and smiled. My name is Jennifer. I am a mother, a teacher, and a survivor. And for the first time in my life, I'm the one holding the pen. My story is no longer a secret. It is mine. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from, or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.